They sliced the throat of a beast so vicious it could gore a horse in seconds. King Ragnar, he demanded this specific meat after every victory against the Saxons or the Franks. The wild boar was more than food. It was a symbol of raw power and unyielding ferocity. In the 9th century, the Scandinavian forests were thick with these massive creatures. A full-grown male could weigh over 300 pounds. Their tusks were sharp as iron knives. Hunting them required nerves of steel and a long spear with a crossguard to prevent the dying animal from sliding up the shaft to kill the hunter. Ragnar Lothbrok lived in a world where every meal was earned through sweat and blood. He rose to fame after the raid on Lindisfarne in 793. His name became a curse in the mouths of kings across Europe, but at home in the Great Hall, he was a provider. The victory stew was the centerpiece of his authority. It was a dense, thick mixture designed to sustain a body broken by shield wall combat. The preparation began with the selection of the animal. Only a mature male would suffice for a king. The hide of the boar was so tough it could deflect a dull axe. They stripped the skin and saved the bristles to make brushes and sewing thread. Then they carved the meat into large chunks. They did not remove the bone. The marrow provided the essential nutrients needed to survive a long winter. They used a massive iron cauldron for the cooking. This pot was made from bog iron pulled from the swamps of Denmark and Sweden. The iron was smelted in a charcoal fire and hammered into shape by a master smith. It could hold over 50 gallons of liquid. The first step was rendering the fat. Boar fat is thick and white and carries the pungent flavor of the deep forest. They melted it over a low fire until the bottom of the cauldron was coated in oil. Then they added the meat to sear it. The sound of the sizzling flesh filled the hall and signaled to the warriors that the feast was near. Ragnar sat on his high seat and watched the smoke rise to the rafters. He knew that a well-fed army was an obedient army. The meat turned a deep brown color as the sugars in the muscle caramelized. They did not use water for the base of the stew. They used a strong, dark ale. This ale was brewed from sprouted barley and flavored with bog myrtle instead of hops. The fermentation process took weeks and resulted in a drink that was thick and slightly sour. This liquid was poured over the seared meat until it was completely submerged. Then the herbs were added. They used wild onions known as ramsons. These grew in the damp, shaded areas of the woods near the coast. They had a sharp bite that cut through the richness of the fat. They also added wild carrots, which were small and bitter and deep purple. These are not like the orange carrots found in modern stores. They were tough and required hours of simmering to become soft. The secret ingredient was the root of the Angelica plant. It grew in the cold northern marshes and had a sweet and spicy flavor. It was believed to protect the body against disease and infection. The fire under the cauldron was kept at a steady heat for at least 6 hours. They used seasoned ash or oak wood to maintain the temperature. The slow cooking process broke down the tough connective tissue in the boar meat. It turned the muscle into tender flakes that would melt in the mouth. They added hazelnut meal to the broth toward the end of the cooking. This acted as a thickener and gave the stew an earthy taste. They also threw in a handful of dried juniper berries. These berries added a piney aroma that reminded the men of the forests they had conquered. It was the smell of victory and survival. Ragnar would take the first bowl. He always ate the heart of the boar first. He believed it would give him the courage of the beast. The rest of the meat was distributed according to rank. The veterans of the great heathen army received the choice cuts from the shoulder and the neck. The younger warriors received the ribs and the shanks. No part of the animal was wasted. They even boiled the head to make a thick jelly. This feast followed the great siege of Paris in 845. Ragnar had led a fleet of 120 ships up the Seine River. He had over 5,000 men under his command. They bypassed the city defenses and struck at the heart of the Frankish kingdom. King Charles the Bald was terrified. He was forced to pay 7,000 pounds of silver to make the Vikings leave. This was the first time a king had paid the Danegeld. Ragnar returned to the north with his ships sitting low in the water from the weight of the treasure. The victory stew that year was the most lavish in history. They added expensive spices stolen from the Frankish markets. They used sea salt from the southern coasts. They even added a hint of saffron that had traveled all the way from the Mediterranean. The Vikings believed in a spiritual connection to the boar. In their mythology, the god Freyr rode a boar named Gullinbursti. This beast had bristles that glowed in the dark. It could run through air and water faster than any horse. They also believed in the cosmic boar Sivrimnir. Every night this animal was slaughtered in the halls of Valhalla to feed the fallen warriors. Every morning it was reborn to be eaten again. This cycle of life and death was the foundation of their warrior culture. Eating the boar stew was a way for Ragnar to connect with the gods. It was a ritual of communion with the divine. His enemies saw him as a monster, but his people saw him as a hero. He provided for them in a harsh land where the soil was thin and the winters were long. The calories in the stew were vital. A single bowl could contain over 2,000 calories. This energy was needed for rowing ships and swinging heavy iron axes. The fat provided insulation against the freezing sea spray. The protein built the muscle needed for the shield wall. The Vikings were taller and stronger than many of the people they encountered because of their high-protein diet. They were the masters of the North Sea because they knew how to fuel their bodies. The social structure of the feast was strict. The mead hall was a place of law and order. Any man who drew a blade during the meal was executed on the spot. The king sat at the head of the long table. His advisors sat to his right and left. The common soldiers sat on benches along the walls. The women served the food and the drink. They used wooden bowls and spoons carved from birch or horn. There were no forks in the 9th century. They used their knives to spear the meat and their fingers to scoop the broth. The sound of hundreds of men eating was like the roar of the ocean. They told stories of their exploits in Northumbria and Mercia. They sang songs about the gods and the giants. The boar stew was the fuel for these legends. Archaeological digs in modern Denmark have found the remains of these feasts. They have uncovered middens filled with the bones of wild boars. Many of these bones show the distinct marks of butchery. They also found traces of the hazelnut meal and the juniper berries in the soil. This proves that the legends of Ragnar and his victory stew are based on physical reality. The ingredients were real. The cooking methods were real. The hunger was real. The hunger was real. Ragnar knew his time on Earth was limited. He lived every day as if it were his last. He fought with a reckless abandon that terrified his foes. But he also celebrated with a passion that inspired his friends. The boar stew was the physical manifestation of his philosophy. It was heavy and rich and full of life. In the year 865, Ragnar met his end in a snake pit in Northumbria. King Ea thought he had finally defeated the Viking legend. But the death of Ragnar only served to unite the Norsemen. His sons led the great heathen army to avenge him. They conquered York and East Anglia. They brought the kingdoms of England to their knees. And before every battle, they ate the same boar stew their father had loved. They carried the tradition into the new lands. They planted the same onions and carrots in the English soil. The flavor of the Scandinavian forest spread across the North Sea. It became the taste of the Viking Age. The smell of the wood smoke and the boiling ale was a warning to the Saxons. It meant that the wolves of the north were here to stay. The stew was a reminder of the wildness that lived inside every Norseman. It was a reminder that they were predators in a world of prey. The boar was their totem. Its strength was their strength. Its ferocity was their ferocity. The iron cauldron remained in the center of the hall long after Ragnar was gone. It was a relic of a time when one man could change the course of history. The fire never truly went out. The tradition of the victory feast continued for centuries. Even when the Vikings converted to Christianity, they kept their love for the boar. They replaced the pagan rituals with church holidays, but the menu stayed the same. The wild boar stew was too important to give up. It was the food of kings and heroes. It was the taste of the North. The chemistry of the dish was perfect for the climate. The high-fat content helped the body produce heat. The iron from the cauldron prevented anemia during the long, dark months. The vitamin C from the wild herbs prevented scurvy on long sea voyages. It was a masterpiece of primitive nutrition. They did not understand the science, but they understood the results. A warrior who ate well fought well. A king who fed his people was a king worth dying for. Ragnar was the master of this logic. He used the stew as a political tool as much as a source of food. It was a bribe and a reward and a promise all in one. Today, the wild boar still roams the forests of Europe. It is still a dangerous and respected animal. Modern chefs try to recreate the recipes of the Viking Age. They use the same ingredients and the same slow cooking techniques, but they can never truly capture the spirit of the original. They lack the context of the shield wall and the longship. They lack the taste of a victory earned with a bloody sword. The original stew was seasoned with the adrenaline of combat. It was eaten by men who had just looked death in the face and laughed. That is an ingredient that cannot be bought in a store. The legacy of King Ragnar lives on in the stories we tell. It lives on in the names of the places he conquered, and it lives on in the memory of a meal that was fit for a god. The fire burns low in the great hall. The meat is tender and the ale is cold. The king raises his bowl to the rafters and shouts a toast to the fallen. The boar is dead, but the feast has just begun. The cycle of the hunt and the meal continues forever. Every victory has its price, and every price is paid in blood. Ragnar Lothbrok knew this better than anyone. He was a man of the forest and a man of the sea. He was the king of the north and the master of the boar. His story ends in a pit of vipers, but his legend lives in the steam rising from a heavy iron pot. The wild boar stew was his gift to his people. It was his final word on what it meant to be a Viking. The embers of the fire glow like the eyes of the beast in the dark. The feast is over, but the history remains. One bowl of meat and ale changed the world forever. It was the exact meal needed to forge an empire from the ice and the salt. Ragnar did not just eat to live. He lived to eat, and he lived to win. The sound of the cauldron bubbling is the heartbeat of the North. It never stops. It never fades. It is the eternal song of the boar. The steam disappears into the night air. The warriors sleep on the benches. The king watches the shadows dance on the stone walls. He is satisfied. He is full. He is Ragnar. The iron is cold now, but the story is still hot. It is a tale of iron and meat and fire. It is the truth of the 9th century. It is the recipe for a legend. The wild boar was the king of the woods until it met the king of the men. Now, they are joined together in the dark broth of history. The hunger of the North was never truly satisfied. It just moved on to the next coast and the next kingdom. And at the end of every raid, there was always a fire and a pot and a beast. This is the way of the sword. This is the way of the boar. The silence of the forest returns as the dawn breaks over the fjord. The hunt will begin again soon. The cycle never ends. Ragnar is gone. But the stew remains on the fire of our memory. It is thick and rich and bitter and sweet. It is the taste of a world that no longer exists, but will never be forgotten. The boar was the sacrifice, and the king was the priest. The meal was the miracle, and the story is the bone that remains when the meat is gone. The great hall is quiet, but the echoes of the feast remain. The smell of the juniper and the ale lingers in the wood. It is a ghost of a time when men were giants and boars were monsters. Ragnar Lothbrok was the greatest of them all, and this was his stew.